Hey guys, BuildZoid here with another PCB breakdown for you. Today we're going to be taking a look at the GTX 1080 Ti Amp Extreme from Zotac. This is a heavily requested card for me, and I've been putting it off for ages and ages and ages and ages because I could not get MOSFET datasheets. Now, I had a suspicion the MOSFETs on this thing were terrible. I must be clairvoyant because now that I do have the datasheets, they are terrible. And the end result is that, it's like, to sum it up, for those of you who don't care about the technical details of why it sucks, this VRM is basically not even better than the VRM you would find on a Founders Edition, really. It seems to actually be less efficient. And, well, it's all down to the MOSFETs that Zotac used. So let's get right into the details of why the MOSFETs here suck so much. So the VCore VRM, which is why, everybody's been requesting this card for so long, is a 16-phase. You have one group of 14 phases over here for VCore. And then behind that you find two more phases because, well, the card is already kind of tall, and if they added two more phases, it would be even taller, so they didn't really feel like doing that. This arrangement has basically these two phases right here do less work than, say, all the phases here, because these are just closer to the core, so the end result is these will be supplying slightly less of the power than the rest of the VRM, but it's really not an issue, especially considering the card really doesn't need a 16-phase, though I guess in this situation where your MOSFETs are this bad, it's just, yeah. Okay, so it is a 16-phase. I'm not going to count all the inductors. The VRM is controlled by this chip right here, which is the very, this thing is common as hell. This is a UP. I need to find a place. I should have extended this border further. Either way, that's a UP. Okay, let's just do it like that. 9511 from UPI Semiconductor. It's an 8-phase voltage controller. It goes up to 600 kilohertz. For all of my calculations here, I'm assuming 600 kilohertz coming out of the chip right here, because ultimately to get a 16-phase out of an 8-phase voltage controller, you're going to need doublers, which we have a ton of. And these aren't actually just straight doublers, these are doubler drivers, so there's no driver ICs on this card. Normally you would have 3 chips for phase doubling of this kind, except the dual drivers that also with the doubling integrated are what Zotac is actually using. So that's these chips. You can clearly see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of them. Basically what happens is you have a PWM signal go into one of them, and then that chip then turns on one phase or the other phase. It never turns on both at the same time. So this is a proper way to do a 16-phase VRM. There's also the option where you turn 2 phases on at the same time, in which case they're not really out of phase, in which case you really shouldn't consider them 2 phases, except most marketing departments would like to argue about that with you. So, I'll leave it up to them on that. But phases probably should be out of phase, otherwise they're not really doing anything. Ultimately, this is a properly controlled 16-phase. Now let's take a look at why it's not a very good 16-phase. Let's just put it this way. This MOSFET, and even these two, really, really suck. So you have 2 low side MOSFETs. That's your low, that's another low, that's your high side MOSFET. And, these 3 MOSFETs make up a single phase. And the thing is, these high side MOSFETs are horrifically slow. These drivers aren't much faster because ultimately these MOSFETs are horrifically slow. And basically your driver IC needs to just be able to drive the MOSFET as fast as it can go. If the MOSFET itself, under perfect conditions, can't go fast, then getting some ridiculously high-end drivers doesn't help. And in this case, these are all relative. All of these MOSFETs are really good on the capacitance. They're actually really low capacitance, so they aren't hard to switch on and off. They're just really slow because of packaging concerns and being discrete. And there's downsides to using discrete MOSFETs like this, which is why you see power stages, which integrate basically everything for efficiency reasons, and then the dual NFETs, which again, the higher level of integration improves efficiency. And ultimately, these MOSFETs here are on semiconductor, no, not on semi, UBIC semiconductor, QN. Hate it. This is like a new product line for them. It still sucks though. 3103 for the high side, and I might have actually mixed that up. No, I didn't. Good job me. I actually prepared the notes. So QN3103, and this thing has a RDS on, like it's a high side MOSFET. It has a really high RDS on, but the main issue with it is this thing takes 43 nanoseconds to turn on under ideal conditions, and 6 nanoseconds to turn off. So it's actually fast to turn off, but this right here is just like, for comparison, the Founders Edition GTX 1080 Ti has MOSFETs that turn on in as fast as 10 nanoseconds under ideal conditions. They don't actually manage that on the Founders Edition because there's not a single driver capable of switching them on that fast, but they can go 10 nanoseconds. And there are drivers that can do like 20 nanoseconds turn on and 10 nanoseconds turn off for the MOSFETs on the Founders Edition. And then you have these things which take 43 nanoseconds to turn on. So this, for the high side MOSFET, is the leading cause of like low efficiency. So the high side VRM losses on this thing are atrocious. Like, they're massive. Now, Zotac could lower the switching frequency, because I'm doing all of my VRM ratings at 300 kilohertz on the phases, right? So basically that would be 600 kilohertz coming from the chip. And it would be really cool if I could confirm that. They could be running it, you know, if they did go from 300 kilohertz to like 150 kilohertz, it would massively improve the VRM efficiency, except at that point, like, the thing is, it's just, why are you doubling in that case? Like, why are you even bothering with all of this extra stuff if you're ultimately going to run the VRM at, at a similar, like, switching frequency that you would be running a regular old 8-phase? So I'm doing all the calculations at 300 kilohertz. It might be that Zotac is actually, you know, running the VRM slower to get some better efficiency out of it, but at 300 kilohertz, that switching, like, that turn on time is just a catastrophe. Now, the low side MOSFETs are QN 3107s, again from UBIC, and these, like, we're not going to talk about switching times, but these are 2.6 milliohm at 25C junction, so that's, you know, as cold as the MOSFET gets. And the worst, 10 volt gate drive, and I'm actually, like, loading all of my calculations in favor of this VRM, so I'm using 10 volt gate to source voltage because that slightly improves RDS on for the low side MOSFETs. Either way, this is really, 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 really high. For comparison, the Founders Edition comes with MOSFETs that are 1.4 milliohm at 10 volt gate to source and 1.7 milliohm at 5 volts. So these suck. And admittedly, this has 32 of them, whereas the Founders Edition has only 14 low-side MOSFETs. But, like, yeah, so this almost has this has more than twice as many MOSFETs, but they're also, like, almost twice as, you know, they're almost twice as high resistance. So overall VRM efficiency ends up being a catastrophe. And for comparison, like this VRM pushing 1.1 volts to the core, because that's the maximum voltage that NVIDIA limits you to, 300 kilohertz switching frequency, and that 10 volts gate to source, they're probably not running it on 10, they're probably running it on 7, just because that's the sort of happy medium of, well, running 10 volt gate drive has some downsides that 7 doesn't. We'll not go into the details. I want to keep this relatively short, and I'm already failing at doing that. So, yeah, but 1.1 volts, 300 kilohertz, 10 volt gate to source. It does make my life easier when I can just use the datasheet values for everything anyway. But 200 amps current output, which that's slightly below a 1080 Ti at stock clocks and stock settings, like a Founders Edition at stock settings, because obviously custom cards like this one have higher TDPs than Founders Editions. This VRM would produce about 25 watts of heat. And I'm inclined to believe that it is this inefficient because Gamers Nexus tested this card and they found that this VRM ends up hitting 95 degrees centigrade, which is absolutely ridiculous for a 16 phase. Like, this thing is huge. Like, this thing is bigger than, like, this VRM all on its own probably has more surface area than some heatsinks that you can find, like VRM heatsinks you can find on some other cards. So this thing doing 95 degrees centigrade is just like that's a catastrophe, and really I think confirms that this just isn't efficient. It's like it does have an aluminum heatsink over it as well. It's not one of those that sinks into the actual fin stack of the card, but ultimately I still think like no, it should not be hitting 95 if it's actually doing, like, if it was a good VRM, this shouldn't be hitting 95 degrees regardless of not having the world's biggest VRM heatsink. And then 300 amps, which this is actually what you might hit on like air-cooled or water-cooled overclocking, and slightly above that even. You're looking at about 42 watts of heat output, which is just like that's awful. It's absolutely terrible. Like, there's cards that do 400 amps at that power output. And then 400 amps, this puts out a whopping 65 watts of heat. Yeah, no, this is just horrifically inefficient. And I'm not, like, I'm not impressed. Because, like, it does run hot. Like, from testing, we already know it runs hot. It doesn't, like, the efficiency, like, the calculations for the efficiency seem to confirm that it should run really hot. The MOSFETs aren't great. It's, yeah, I mean, this is how you build something that looks really great on paper, and then, well, it doesn't even look great on paper. It's just a case of marketing department wanted bigger numbers for the VRM, so they got big numbers. 16 phases is certainly a bigger number than 7 that you would find on like a Founders Edition, or 8, or even 10. Like the Gaming X is an 8-phase, the Asus Strix and the EVGA FTW are both 10-phase, if I remember correctly. I'm not sure about the FTW, that might not be a 10. The Gaming Extreme from Gigabyte, which uses power stages, which I can't remember which ones right now, but that's a 12-phase. You know, all of those cards have better VRMs than this. Except this one has more phases, so this one's got to be better for the average, like, the average buyer is going to assume that, hey, it's got 16 phases, it's got to be amazing. Well, it's not, because these 16 phases are made of some of the, like, these are MOSFETs that you'd be, like, you would find these used, like, this grade of MOSFET, you might see Asus use this on, like, their cheapest 1070. That's kind of the level of quality these MOSFETs are. You know, the GTX 1070 Dual and the GTX 1070 Turbo from Asus. This is the kind of MOSFET Asus would use for that card. And that card is like that's one of the cheapest 1070s there is. So, yeah, you know, really unimpressive for a 16 phase. Actually, even by, like, like, ignoring the phase count, really unimpressive. For comparison, the Founders Edition does 200 amps at around 20 watts of heat output. Which is actually really damn good. And then 300 amps at 35. So the thing about the Founders Edition is ultimately it ends up dropping off as you get, like, well, this drops off at high current as well. So yeah. But the Founders Edition is like actually better than this. It does 400 amps at 44 watts. Yeah. That's really not great. So basically, a Founders Edition VRM is better than this thing, which it is what it is. I mean, these MOSFETs are garbage, and the Founders Edition uses some really, really nice dual NFETs from Fairchild Semiconductor. You know, so yeah, good job, Zotac. For comparison, the Hall of Fame you know, from Galax, the best 1080 Ti PCB you can get does 300 amps on 25 watts of heat output. It does 100 amps more for the same amount of, like, you know, heat loss, which is just, that's ridiculous. Also, I loaded these Frontier, the Founders Edition calculations, I loaded them in favor of the Zotac because I was using a 5-volt gate drive for all of these, just to make this look slightly less terrible. But yeah, that's like, yeah, that's not great. I mean, it's a 16 phase and it's awful for a 16 phase. It's not so bad that, like, if you have this card, you should go return it or something. But it's like, if you're considering buying this card, do not just buy it because it has a 16 phase. It's not a good 16 phase. The MOSFETs are garbage. Like, absolutely garbage. Yeah. And as a result, basically the entire VRM is as well. So, yeah. Though, actually, as I did mention, Zotac could be lowering the switching frequency of the VRM to get that power consumption, you know, to get the efficiency under control. And that would actually make a pretty significant, like, that would make a significant difference. That's not minor. Just, I didn't actually do the calculations for 150. So that would be 300 kilohertz out of the voltage controller. But if you were doing, let's just say 300 amps on 150 kilohertz switching, then it would actually drop down to about 28 watts of heat output for 300 amps, which wouldn't be bad. That actually is pretty decent, but ultimately, you're kind of losing the whole benefit of having 16 phases because you're running that lower switching frequency. So, yeah, you know, at 300 kilohertz, this thing is horrifically inefficient. At 150 kilohertz, it's actually pretty damn good, but it's like everything else has a voltage regulation advantage at that point. Admittedly, on NVIDIA cards, it's like, you know, the requirement for very stable voltages is really, really low because the cards don't scale with voltage basically at all. And the difference between, like, a really great VRM and a really terrible VRM on a 1080 Ti might be like 25 megahertz if you had the same chip on both PCBs, which, you know, you'd have to account for. Like, you won't see a good comparison of that because you have to account for the silicon lottery, and that's just a nightmare. But, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not bad, but it don't be fooled, basically. Don't be fooled. You shouldn't be buying this card for the VRM, because the VRM really isn't that impressive. If you're buying it for the cooler or something, then knock yourself out, but not the VRM, because it's just not good enough. Now, the memory VRM is more of the same, except now we have 2 phases instead of 16. Same low-side MOSFETs, same high-side MOSFETs. Luckily, this VRM doesn't really need to do anything. At 1.35 volts, 300 kilohertz switching, so 1.35 volts output, because that's GDDR5X running voltage. 300 kilohertz switching frequency and 35 amps output current, which I don't think GDDR5X actually hits that on the VDD rail. So that would produce about 7 watts of heat on this VRM, which, again, like, that's fine. That's in line with most of the memory VRMs on most of the other GTX 1080 Ti's, mostly because most of the other GTX 1080 Ti's use this kind of quality level MOSFETs for their memory VRMs. So that's why that's comparable when the VCore VRMs are just really in favor of basically everything else. So, yeah. Let's move on to some of the minor stuff. This right here should be the 1.8 volts. I am not entirely 100% sure about that because I don't have the card in hand, but that would be 1.8 volts. That would be doing VPP for the GDDR5X, as well as powering some of the internal PLLs of the GPU. And there's one other thing that 1.8 volt, like, oh yeah, and it powers the BIOS system of NVIDIA cards. They use 1.8 volts, what's it called, read-only? I can't remember. The BIOS chips run on 1.8 volts on NVIDIA cards. So it powers that as well. Now, down here, buried under all of my scribbles, is the 1 volt PEX or PCIe or PLL or whatever, or auxiliary whatever, and MSI decided to call it this time around. This powers some of the internal PLLs of the GPU, as well as I think the PCIe connection. And this is super useful for, like, tweaking this voltage is super handy on liquid nitrogen, and on air cooling it basically does nothing. On air water cooling it basically does nothing. But on liquid nitrogen it is absolutely necessary to get these cards above 2.5 gigahertz. So yeah, if you would like to power mod this card by, lowering the resistance of your shunts, they're located over here. There's 3 of them, and I think that's all of them on the card. I certainly can't find any other ones. I think this right here should be the INA 3221. So that's the Texas Instruments current and voltage bus monitor. Nah, it's the thing that measures the voltage drop across the shunts and calculates your power consumption. That's what it is. I can't remember the proper term for it. That thing, if you want to do the liquid metal mod, there's your shunts. If you want to do a more, if you want to do my power mod where I completely blew out the power limit on like my GTX 1070, you're going to need to do it on that. Unfortunately, for some reason, I think this is another INA 3221. I'm not entirely sure. But this arrangement of capacitor and resistors, that looks like an INA 3221 because of that, and this looks like one as well, and this is closer to the shunts, so I'm not 100% sure what this second one is for. This one probably measures all of these shunts. I have no idea what that one does. I have no idea why it even exists. But yeah. So that's this side of the PCB. Let's flip it over and take a look at the back. And on the back we find some big super capacitor. Well, I think these are probably going to be some kind of proadlizer. And these are basically very large aluminum polymer capacitors that are designed to, these are really, really good at smoothing out voltage. These are really, really good at that. Unfortunately, they're also really hard. Like, you can't get them in a high endurance, high lifespan flavor. The only ones I've ever seen are 105 degrees for 2,000 hours, whereas most aluminum polymer capacitors you can get regular aluminum polymers going from anything from 2,500 to 12,000 hours, depending on what the manufacturer is inclined to use. But yeah, no, these are pretty cool. Unfortunately, they're really close to the VRM, which this VRM does run really hot, so these might not have the best lifespan. They also probably don't do anything for this card's overall overclocking capability anyway. But they do save, Zotac basically, the main benefit of these is they replace an entire, the usual large mix of ceramic and, usually you end up with a big mix of various capacitors right coming off of the VRM for your filtering. These pretty much replace all of that. So that does simplify the PCB design. Doesn't necessarily have any major advantages here for overclocking. So yeah, you also get all of these very interesting, you have a VDD point right there, SWCLK. This looks like they've hooked up the an I2C interface for something. I'm not sure if these are supposed to be for the end user. It looks like they kind of might be. Then these look like they could be measuring points, but it's really weird because they're not marked out. So they're not labeled properly, so I have no idea what those are supposed to be. This looks like they've given you access to I2C for something on the card, which won't be the UP9511 because that's an analog voltage controller. There's no interface on that thing. So that's really odd that's there. I'm not sure what that's for either, but it is kind of cool, so I figured I'd point it out. Yeah, that's pretty much it about this card. I mean, if you like the heatsink on it, or you like the RGB support on it, or whatever it is that you like about this card, it's not bad. You just shouldn't buy it for the PCB because there's a lot better PCBs out there, like the the Strix from Asus, the FTW from EVGA, the Gigabyte Gaming Extreme. Pretty much any custom card is better than this. The Founders Edition might also be more power efficient than this one, depending on what switching frequency Zotac is ultimately running this on. So, you know, it's not bad. I'm not saying you have to return your card if you have one. It's just, it's not great, which I think a lot of people expected, considering that, oh, it's got a 16 phase, which ultimately doesn't do much. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below with any questions or any complaints you may have. If you would like to, what else is there? If you would like to support what I do here at Actually Hardcore Overclocking, I have a PayPal, Patreon, there's shirts. You can find that all in a link down in the description below. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.